One more quick announcement I was reminded about. Next Sunday for lunch, before we have the elections meeting, there'll be a pizza lunch provided. There's also a sign-up genius out there for bringing side dishes, salads, and desserts, things like that. So if you would like to help out with that, I think you can ask Sarah. Has the information? Pardon? Right, so if you didn't see that, then Sarah can make sure that you get that invitation so you can help sign up. Today we're going to be exhorted by Brother Caleb Barnes. His subject is resistance. He has no reading, so with that, I'll turn it over to Brother Caleb.
Morning. So, Walter, in order to change, I just click one of the buttons up here. See him? Okay. All right. I'll figure it out. Yes. Okay. All right. All right. Well, good morning again. Today, I would like to talk about resistance. And this can be taken many different ways. It can be taken as someone who chooses to do something stubborn, or someone who doesn't recognize God's will, doesn't recognize God's ways, and we know what that ultimately leads to. But we do know that if we resist evil, and if we follow God's direction, and we allow God to form our life, it can lead to everlasting life. So hopefully as we go through today, we'll find that we do resist in a positive way, which is the avoidance of sin and filling our life without direction from God. So again, this is what we're looking for this morning, is for God to actively direct our life. And the more I feel that I'm in control of my life, the more it makes me kind of step back and say, maybe I'm looking at this the wrong way. So again, having God direct us is the goal. So this morning I want to look at a couple examples of people who resisted negatively, and then one positive example of resistance. So the first one I'd like to look at this morning is that of Balaam. We all kind of know the story of Balaam, and we know how that played out, but the lesson is the same for us, that even someone who was a prophet from God, someone who God constantly was in communication with, if he can be corrupted, how much more do we need to be on the lookout? And just as a little history, we know that Balaam was a prophet during the time of Moses. And in Numbers chapter 22, verse 20, God continuously warns Balaam to not go beyond what I tell you to do. And every time we know Balaam inches further and further away from what God wanted. We know that he fought God at every turn. And Balaam wanted that ability to be the one to curse Israel, right? Balak came to Balaam, and Israel at the time was, I guess you could say, kind of the it nation. They just got out of Egypt, and they were defeating Egypt, and they were defeating a lot of countries around them, so they kind of had a target on their back. So this was Balaam's angle. He was trying to maneuver his way to be, the diviner of the time, and money was his drawback. So again, this brought out his major flaw, and it's one that we can see kind of in the world around us. He believed that, the ends justified the means. The way he was going to get there was to, by his own self-interest rather than beliefs or standards in God. We look at Numbers 22, verse 35. Read it real quick. And the angel of the Lord said unto Balaam, Go with them, but only the word that I shall speak unto you, that thou shalt speak. So this is about the fourth time that God has already said this to Balaam. And we know in Scripture, if God repeats something, it's important and we need to pay attention to it. So again, Balaam wanted riches and honor. He wanted to be able to serve God and serve Mammon, and that's what drove Balaam. God spoke to Balaam time and again, and he appeared to him visibly, and he appeared to him as an angel, and God even spoke to Balaam through a donkey. God changed Balaam's words in his mouth, causing him to speak blessings instead of cursings, And God put his spirit in him, and Balaam prophesied under the inspiration of the Spirit of God, and yet Balaam still tried to do his own will, not God's will. Balaam never really understood the connection between obedience and blessing, or obedience and his relationship with God. And we know that God gave him very simple commandments, right? He said, I'm going to put my word in your mouth, and this is exactly what you're going to say. And just like a child or someone who decides to do their own will, that's all that Balaam could do in his life. So Balaam wanted to do both of these things, right? He wanted to serve God, but he also wanted the riches. He also wanted his name to be proclaimed. And we know that God's ultimate plan is that his glory will be shown. So Balaam is an illustration of a person who accesses the truth, a person who reads and studies their Bible every day, but is never able to fully obey it, right? Is never able to fully put it into action or practice in his life. And this is a very relatable person for us. I know for myself, it's the type of person that, tax time comes around, you say, oh, I probably donated about $1,000 to Goodwill, so I'll take that deduction, or I'll do this, or I'll take this little bit extra money here, which we know in Exodus says that, you shall not steal. So we have that knowing, and we have that ability to relate to Balaam. But I think one thing that's important to note about Balaam is that Balaam was a wicked prophet, and he was not a false prophet. Because Balaam did hear from God, and God did give him true prophecies to speak. But we know, due to Balaam's heart not being right with God, he eventually showed his true colors, and that was when he betrayed Israel, and he sort of tricked Israel into doing what they did. So again, this affirms our goals for this morning, and this is what happens when we decide to choose our ways over God's ways. So it was not God's direction that led Balaam's actions, but Balaam's resistance to God's direction that drove Balaam to sin. The next person I'd like to look at this morning is Saul. We know that Saul was Israel's first king, and unfortunately the people failed to realize that they already had a perfect king in God. But we read in 1 Samuel 8, verse 5, that they wanted to be like the other nations. So they chose a mortal king, and they chose Saul. We know from Scripture that God often gives people what they want, even though it may not be what's best for them. God gave them a king, knowing what this would do to them. We know the first king was Saul, followed by David, and then Solomon. And then after Solomon, the kingdom of Israel was divided into two, Israel and Judah, and king reigning in each one. So just to recap, Israel wanted the king. They got Saul, who was terrible. They got David, who was a man after God's own heart. And then they got Solomon, who was good and bad, and finally at the end turned to God. So real quickly, I'd just like to read the list of the kings of Israel after Solomon. So you have Jeroboam the first, he was rebellious. Nadab was bad. Baasha was wicked. Elah, evil. Zimri was sinful. Tibni was iniquitous. Omri was extra bad. Ahab was the worst to that point. Ahaziah was disobedient. Jehoram was mostly rotten. Jehu, not good, but he was better than the rest. Jehoahaz was non-compliant. Joash was wayward. Jeroboam II, badly behaved. Zechariah was abysmal. Shalem, full of vice. Menahem was horrible. Pekahiah was idolatrous. Pekah was awful. Hoshea was appalling. So those were the kings of Israel. And now we're going to look at the kings of Judah. Rehoboam was mostly bad. Abijah, mostly perverted. Asa was good. Jehoshaphat was righteous. Jehoram was terrible. Ahaziah was bad. Athaliah was devilish. Joash was mostly virtuous. Amaziah was mostly wholesome. Uzziah, mostly respectable. Jotham was worthy. Ahaz was heinous. Hezekiah was the best. Manasseh was depraved until the end when he repented. Ammon was treacherous. Josiah was great. Jehoahaz was dreadful. Jehoiakim was a degenerate. Jehoiachin was frightful, and Zedekiah was foolish. So again, God often gives us what we want, and sometimes it's not what we need. So after the split of Israel and Judah, you had a list of, I think it's a little bit over 40 kings and about 400 plus years. And there was only 4 or 5 kings that were considered to be good or righteous out of all this. So again, God gave the people what they asked for, right? He gave them a continual, dreadful period of time where they were going to be led by people who were not righteous. And this leads us to the understanding that we always need to ask in God's will, right? Every Sunday morning we recite the Lord's Prayer and we say, not my will, but thy will be done. So again, God gave them what they wanted, and it was not pretty for several hundred years. So we know that Saul seemed to be an ideal king. 1 Samuel 9, verses 1 and 2 says, Now there was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Becherath, the son of Apihiah, a Benjamite, a mighty man of power. And he had a son whose name was Saul, a choice young man and a goodly. And there was not among the children of Israel a goodlier person than he. From his shoulders and upward, he was higher than any of the people. So we do know that there was just really one thing wrong with Saul, was that he was not a spiritual man. We know that Saul was driven by his flesh, and he was controlled by his own nature. He was not spiritually minded, and God was not in Saul's thoughts. Romans 8, verse 8 says, So then they that are in the flesh cannot be of God. In 1 Samuel chapter 10, we know that the Spirit of God was with Saul. And we know, obviously, as we read on, that this does not mean that Saul was a spiritual man. But at the start, God was with Saul and with the Spirit. 1 Samuel 19 tells the story of when Saul was after David. Saul sent 3 different people to David, right? He sent the first guy, and the Spirit of God came upon him. And he sent another person, the Spirit of God came upon him, and then another person. And finally, Saul said, I'm just going to go down and I'll take care of this myself. So Saul goes down there, and what happens? Saul gets naked, and he lays on the floor for a day and a night prophesying to God. So again, God came upon Saul, and we know that doesn't mean that he was spiritual, because in Numbers 22, we know that God came in the form of a donkey. So King Saul's journey started very bright before the Lord, but before long, we know that his works of the flesh took over. I think that there are 9 works of the flesh that really drove Saul to resisting the Lord. Number 1 is impatience. In 1 Samuel 13, Samuel commanded Saul to wait for him to arrive before he sacrificed to God. But Saul, choosing to do his own will, sacrificed. Number 2 is rebellion. In 1 Samuel 15, God gave Saul a clear command that he was to utterly destroy the Amalekites, down to the women, the children, and the livestock. The lesson that Saul didn't learn is that partial obedience is the same as disobedience, right? Saul was to utterly destroy the Amalekites and get rid of everything. And as we know from history, Israel got into a lot of trouble with the Amalekites. So, if Saul had just done what the Lord had asked him and removed the Amalekites out of the equation and removed sin, that could have saved Israel for hundreds of years of awful things that happened. So again, the lesson is for us. Do we utterly destroy sin? Do we allow sin to hang around? Do we allow a bad habit to take root? or do we totally squash it? Number 3 is cowardice or lack of faith. We know in 1 Samuel 17 that we read about David and Goliath. And as we already read, there was no bigger man in Israel than Saul, right? He was head and shoulders above any other man. Saul's lack in faith came through, and that allowed for David to defeat Goliath with one small smooth stone. Number 4 is jealousy. 1 Samuel 18 depicts David arriving from battle, and we hear the people in the streets chanting, Saul has slain his thousands, David his 10,000s. Numbers 5, 6, and 7 are found in Galatians 5, verses 19 to 21. Now the works of flesh are manifest, which are these: adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, variance, emulations, wrath, strife, seditions, heresies, envyings, murders, drunkenness, revelings, and such like, of which I tell you before, as I have told you in times past, that they which do such things shall not inherit the kingdom of God. The ones that stick out here obviously are hatred and anger. So we know that's what fueled Saul in his fight against David. We know the story of when Ahimelech helped David, right? David needed bread, and so the priest gave David bread. And what did Saul do in 1 Samuel 22? Saul killed 85 men who wore the linen ephod. So he didn't just kill Ahimelech, he killed 85 other people out of anger, for they had helped David. Number 8 is insincere repentance or lying tongue. 1 Samuel 24 tells the story of Saul kneeling before David and weeping and saying how sorry he was and how he was never, ever going to attempt to kill David again. But we know that a couple chapters later, David was in the wilderness of Ziph, and Saul took 3,000 men and hunted David. Number 9 is witchcraft and disbelief. This also is mentioned as the works of the flesh in Galatians 5. We know that Saul chose to forsake God, so God forsook Saul. Not recognizing this, we know that Saul turned to a medium, and we know how that turned out. We know that she told him how he was going to die. So, obviously we are different than Saul. We don't really relate to him, but the idea is the same, is that we have the same flesh, right? We have that same battle that we fight. So do we deny God's direction? Do we not allow him to direct our paths? So now that we've gone over a couple of bad examples, I'd like to focus on one of my favorite Bible characters, someone who constantly was put into kind of situations where you feel bad for him, and it never seemed like life was fair. And a lot of times I can relate to that feeling where I think I'm the only one who ever experiences some bad thing that happens in my life, and that's not true. But this person is Joseph. We know that Joseph was the first son of Jacob by Rachel, and we know that Jacob loved Rachel more than any of his other wives or concubines, and so Joseph was his most beloved son. And we know for this reason Joseph's brothers resented and hated him, and to make things worse, Joseph received the coat of many colors, and he also told dreams that did not put his brothers in good light and showed them that they were going to bow down to him and make him their master. So throughout Joseph's life, he was continually put into situations where he could have easily resisted, where he could have easily chosen the path of sin. And like Moses, who is mentioned in Hebrews 11, chose righteousness instead of choosing sin. But we know with all the things that are mentioned in Joseph's life, the one thing that is not mentioned is any sin, right? We don't have any recorded sin that Joseph committed in the Bible. We obviously know that he did sin, but it's not written down and it's not recorded. But I really think that God wanted it this way to show us what kind of character Joseph had, to show us what type of person he was. And I don't think there is a better type of Christ than Joseph. Because more than anyone, Joseph had reason to to have these doubts, and even a thought of anger or doubt could technically be considered a sin, right? So we know that every time he was put in a situation like this, his reaction was one that pleased God. So if you bear with me real quick, I'm going to read, I've got a list of types, and these are just a couple of them. I think there are a bunch more, but these really kind of show us what type of person Joseph was, and how he was a good type of Christ. We know that Joseph was a shepherd. We know that Jesus is the great shepherd. Joseph was loved by his father, and Jesus was beloved by his father. Joseph was hated by his brothers. We know Jesus was hated by his brothers in John 1, verse 11. Joseph was hated for his words, and we know that Jesus was hated for his words and truth. Joseph was promised a remarkable future. Jesus looked past the cross to enjoy what was set before him. Joseph foretold of his future sovereignty. Jesus did the same in Matthew 26. Joseph was envied by his brothers, and Jesus was envied by his own brothers. Joseph was sent by his father to his brothers, and Jesus was sent to the lost sheep of Israel. Joseph sought out his brothers, and we know that Jesus sought out us and sought out believers. Joseph sought the welfare of his brothers. Jesus came not to condemn the world, but all of the world might be saved through him. Joseph sought his brothers until he found them. We know that Jesus seeks us until he finds us. And this is the initiative of Jacob and the initiative of God. Joseph was conspired against, and we know that Jesus was conspired against. Joseph was sold for 20 pieces of silver, which at the time was the price of what a slave cost. Jesus was sold for 30 pieces of silver, which in his time was the amount that you would pay for a slave. Joseph's blood was sprinkled upon the goat. Joseph's blood sprinkled on the coat was made from a goat. It's presented to his father. Jesus is our scapegoat, and his blood was presented to the Father as a sin offering. Joseph was sorely tempted and did not sin. Jesus was also prosperous and did not sin. Joseph was cast into prison, though he was innocent. And we know that Jesus was sentenced to death, even though Pilate could find no fault in him. Joseph suffered at the hands of the Gentiles, first by his brothers, and then by the Gentiles. Jesus was sold by his brethren, and then suffered at the hands of the Romans. Joseph was 30 years old when he began his ministry, and Jesus was 30 when he began his public ministry. Joseph's exaltation was followed by a season of plenty. And we know after Christ's return, we followed by a season of plenty. Joseph was condemned with 2 criminals. Jesus was also crucified with 2 criminals. One criminal was given life in the jail with Joseph. The other was given death. Jesus told one of the criminals, "Today you shall be with me in paradise." Joseph married a foreign bride who shared his glory in Genesis 41, and we know that we are the bride of Christ through baptism and joint heirs. So there is no doubt of the correlation between Joseph and Christ. And throughout his life, Joseph was able to do this because of his faith in God. In Genesis 40, verse 4, so it tells us that Joseph was in charge of the prison, yet he chose to serve the people in the prison. So through service to those who he was in charge of, Joseph was able to show his true character. And to me, this is the biggest test. My greatest kind of struggles come when things are great, right? I do know that if something bad happens, my first thought is I'm going to turn to God, but that's really not the way I want to look at it. I want to be always turning to God, even when things are great, because that's when we really need God the most. When we feel that we're in control and we feel that we're prosperous, that for me is when I need to take a step back and realize that I'm not. And I also don't want to turn to God like like a child, right? If something goes wrong and I immediately turn to God, I kind of think of that as the attitude of a kind of a spoiled little kid who knew he wasn't supposed to do what he did, and he decided he was going to do it anyways, and this is the outcome that comes of it. So service to God is paramount, and recognizing when we need God the most. So by learning from these mistakes and choosing to resist sin and follow God, these burdensome times can sometimes turn into peace. Joseph never once doubted the Lord. He never once faltered in his service. And he was able to do so because regardless of whatever situation Joseph was in, he was 100% dependent on God. Just like in Joseph's time, there were 7 good years of plenty and 7 years of famine. So the same is for our spiritual lives. God gives us this time to reflect. God gives us this time to turn to him so that when we do need him, he's always there for us. Thank you.